A controversial Star Trek movie romance was secretly set up by Uhura's very first lines. The romantic element between Spock and Uhura in 2009's Star Trek movie was certainly controversial, but not something J.J. Abrams' reboot pulled entirely from thin air. While the first entry in Star Trek's Kelvin timeline enjoyed critical and commercial success, placing Zachary Quinto's Spock in a relationship with Zoe Saldana's Nyota Uhura proved the one major sticking point. The duo never shared more than a friendship throughout Star Trek, the original series, and the ensuing movies, so the Uhura subplot felt like an egregious breach of canon. Both Spock and Uhura trace back to the very beginnings of Star Trek. Leonard Nimoy's Vulcan featured in original pilot episode The Cage before joining the main cast in Star Trek's first aired episode, The Man Trap, in September 1966. Nichelle Nichols' Uhura was not part of Pike's crew visibly, at least during the events of The Cage, but did feature during several key scenes of The Man Trap to make a memorable Star Trek TV debut. Surprisingly, that debut also sowed the seeds for Star Trek 2009's romance with Spock. Uhura's first Star Trek line set up her 2009 movie romance with Spock. Uhura made a brief appearance at the very beginning of Star Trek's The Man Trap, stationed away from the familiarity of her communications console and sitting in what would later become Chekhov's traditional spot. While this marked Uhura's maiden scene, her very first lines came some 10 minutes into the episode during an exchange with Spock. Uhura's first lines could certainly be interpreted as the beginnings of a romantic connection with Spock. Musing on the science officer's emotionless demeanor, Uhura wistfully dropped pearls such as, "Why don't you tell me I'm an attractive young lady?" or "Ask me if I've ever been in love." She asked about the beauty of Vulcan's evening moon, then left disappointed when Spock responded with all the charm and warmth of a dying duck. In the isolated timeline of Star Trek, the original series, this conversation was likely not intended as verbal foreplay teasing a burning attraction on the starboard side of the Enterprise's bridge. It was more an indication of what dialogue looked like for female characters in the 1960s. Yeoman Rand received similar treatment in the very same episode, and the premise of The Man Trap itself was largely about men perceiving an alien creature as the woman they secretly desire. From a modern perspective, however, Uhura's first lines could certainly be interpreted as the beginnings of a romantic connection with Spock. If that same exchange happened in any show made after 1990, audiences could be reasonably sure that the two characters involved were heading for a hookup. Star Trek 2009 might, therefore, argue that its Spock and Uhura romance wasn't invented from nothing and actually pulled from clues, intentional or otherwise, that lay buried in the bones of the source material. Spock and Uhura's Star Trek 2009 romance still didn't work, even if it was teased by TOS, while J.J. Abrams could get away with claiming that Spock and Uhura's romance in the 2009 Star Trek movie was expanding upon unrealized plot threads and clues from the original series. That doesn't necessarily mean the story was right to include. The angle did feel odd canon-wise, firstly because it took the TV show's mild flirting and turned it into a full-blown relationship, and secondly because it morphed the famously logical Spock into something of a college boyfriend stereotype, fumbling to balance his career and love life. The real problems, however, went much deeper. Spock and Uhura's movie romance wasn't problematic simply because it changed canon, but because it added almost nothing to Star Trek 2009's story. It did Uhura a disservice, perpetuating the Hollywood notion that female leads must be validated by their status as a male character's partner, not just because of what they bring to the crew in terms of skills, talents, and personality. When J.J. Abrams rebooted the Star Trek universe in 2009, he did more than recast iconic roles and inject blockbuster flair into Gene Roddenberry's cerebral sci-fi. He dared to spark one of the franchise's most unexpected and controversial romances, Spock and Uhura. To many Trekkies, this pairing came out of nowhere, a modern twist with little narrative foundation. But what if the seeds of their relationship were planted far earlier than most realized, hidden in plain sight in Uhura's very first lines? Rewatch the 2009 Star Trek film with fresh eyes, and you'll find that Uhura's debut scene is not only flirtatious, it establishes a layered dynamic between her and Spock that subtly reshapes their roles from the start. It's in that smoky bar on Earth where Uhura verbally spars with an arrogant James T. Kirk. Their exchange is laced with wit and resistance, but it's her response to Kirk's line, "What's your name?" that opens a thematic door, Uhura. Just one word, but loaded with confidence. Kirk presses, "No first name?" Her smile sharpens. "I have no problem with you calling me Uhura." She's in control of the conversation, and more importantly, she's withholding. She reveals what she wants to reveal, nothing more. That tone sets up who Uhura is in this universe: intelligent, assertive, and unwilling to be defined by a man's gaze. But it also hints at a deeper emotional intelligence and guardedness, qualities that mirror Spock's own stoic demeanor. As the film progresses, we see that Spock and Uhura share a unique wavelength, a space of mutual respect and privacy. And in fact, Spock is introduced shortly after her with an emotional turmoil of his own, balancing his Vulcan logic and human heritage. That internal tension draws Uhura to him, not despite his emotionlessness, but because of it. So, when the film later reveals they are in a romantic relationship, it's shocking, but not unjustified. Uhura's very first scene frames her as someone who values privacy and emotional depth. Spock, despite his outward stoicism, offers both. What feels like a sudden twist in their kiss before Spock departs for a potentially fatal mission is, in truth, the culmination of a quiet arc. Their bond is not loud or performative. It is quiet, resilient, and born from mutual recognition. The romance's controversy stems largely from its departure from canon. In Roddenberry's original series, there was no sign of romance between Uhura and Spock. In fact, Spock's most famous entanglement was arguably with Nurse Chapel, and even that was fleeting. But Abrams' reboot presented an alternate timeline, one where emotions bubble closer to the surface and the old rules don't apply. For some fans, this felt like a betrayal. For others, it was a refreshing recalibration of gender dynamics and emotional complexity. Look closer, and you'll see the signs in their early interactions. Uhura gently challenges Spock's decisions, but never undermines him. He, in turn, respects her intellect and refrains from the arrogance some other officers wield toward subordinates. Theirs is a bond built on trust and quiet admiration. Even their arguments are handled in subdued tones, a stark contrast to the high-octane drama surrounding them. The emotional payoff of their relationship arrives not in grand gestures, but in subtle beats. When Vulcan is destroyed and Spock momentarily loses control, Uhura doesn't comfort him with klitsch or pity. She simply is there. And when he regains composure, their silent exchange says more than words could. In a franchise built on logic versus emotion, they embody the balance. Critics of the pairing argue that it was inserted to modernize the series with a conventional Hollywood romance. But rewatch the film with care, and the groundwork is undeniable. Uhura's first words don't just introduce her, they set her apart. They mark her as someone Spock would notice. Not because she's different from the other cadets, but because she shares his instinct for restraint and insight. In this light, their romance isn't a detour from Star Trek tradition. It's a subtle evolution of it. Uhura, long a background figure in the original series, is given agency and emotional depth. Spock, often